Welcome to our February 2025 Wild Ones River City program. My name is Linda Gary, and I'm the president of the River City chapter for this year. For those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we are a local chapter of a national organization. We're a nonprofit that focuses on increasing biodiversity through native plant landscaping. And our stated mission is to connect people and native plants for a healthy planet. So our program tonight is called Minimizing the Error in Trial and Error. And I, for one, am really excited to learn how to minimize my gardening errors, as I seem to always have a lot of them. So Mike Weis, the owner of Dropseed Gardens, will be our speaker. So in our past Zoom webinars, we've had folks from West Michigan, but also from around the state and from other states as well. So if you would like to put your name and your location in the chat box, please do. It's always fun to see where everybody is listening from tonight. Before we move into our program, I want to put in a plug for being a member of Wild Ones. Most of our events and programs are open and free to everyone, and that's exactly how we want it to be. We don't want there to be any barriers to anyone getting information about native plants and the wider world of restoring ecosystems. So there are some advantages to being a member of Wild Ones. Being a member enables you to support an organization that you believe in, and it's also a way to help provide funding so we can offer these many free events and opportunities. As a member, you are also able to access some web pages on the Wild Ones website, both the national and local chapters, that are only for members. And our River City chapter also offers garden walkabouts that are hosted by members for members. So the garden walkabouts are like garden tours, open house garden tours of a member's garden. And they're very informative and interesting, but you need to be a member to participate in those. Wild Ones River City members also have an early option to order plants at our annual native plant sale, which is in June this year. We try to have enough plants for everyone to get what they want, but we do sometimes run out of the more popular ones. So if you're able to order early as a member, you don't have that problem. You can always get the plants that you want. So on our website, there's a link where you can join. You join through the National Wild Ones website, but when you put River City as your chapter, that will connect you to us here. If you're not in the Grand Rapids area, there are lots of other Michigan Wild Ones chapters, as well as chapters in other states. So I hope that you can find one near you. Okay, I have one more plug to offer. It's to encourage you to sign up for some volunteer opportunities this year. It's a great way to meet other wild ones and have a lot of fun. We have lots of outreach opportunities where you can staff our display booth with another person at a local event. You get to talk to people about native plants and give away brochures and handouts. Signups for these outreach events are through a link on our website to Sign Up Genius. So we will also be starting work days in our native plant education garden when spring gets here. Garden work days are once a month. And this garden is located on Cherry Street in Grand Rapids. It was established in 2012 and now has over 85 different native plant species in it. We do garden maintenance like pulling weeds and putting down mulch, and sometimes you get to even take a few plants home that have wandered into places where they shouldn't be. Okay, before we introduce our speaker, there are some housekeeping items that I want to remind you guys about. There are several buttons at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure most of you are pretty adept at these webinars by now, but just a reminder, the chat button at the bottom of your screen is where you can type in comments during the presentation. And that's also where, if we have websites or other links that correlate to the program, we will post them there. The Q&A button also at the bottom of your screen is to type in questions that you would like Mike to answer at the end of his presentation. And also, if you would like a picture of any of Mike's slides for future reference, please feel free to take a screenshot. He has a lot of good information on his slides, and sometimes it's nice to have that for future reference. Lastly, you will receive an email in a couple of days with a link to the YouTube recording of this program. You're welcome to pass it on to anyone who you think would enjoy it. So before Sandy Berg, our program committee co-chair, introduces our speaker, I want to leave you with this quote that was in our Wild Ones River City February e-news. I think it's very appropriate, especially for tonight where here in Grand Rapids anyway, it's snowy and blowy and very wintry. So here it is. Anyone who thinks gardening begins in the spring and ends in the fall is missing the best part of the year. For gardening begins in winter with the dream. So I hope everyone is dreaming right now. Spring will be here before we know it. All right, Sandy, you can introduce him. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda, and good evening, everyone. Mike Weis is a man of many talents and interests. He earned his Bachelor of Fine Arts at Indiana University and is an accomplished percussionist, composer, and conceptual photographer. His photographs have been displayed at multiple shows. He has a long list of recordings, both solo and in collaboration with other musicians. His most recent solo release in 2022 is entitled Ring the Bell for 10,000 Forgotten Things, a beautiful arrangement of percussion and sound recordings taken during winter at Indiana Dunes National Park. But Mike is not here to talk about these accomplishments tonight. He's most recently been devoting his efforts toward ecological restoration on public and private lands. He has been gardening with native plants since 2005 and is the owner of the Kalamazoo-based native plant landscape company, Dropseed, Native Gardens and Ecological Restoration. In addition, Mike works seasonally for Hidden Savanna Native Plant Nursery and volunteers as an ecological steward for Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy and Stewards of Kleinstuck, a nature preserve in Kalamazoo. Mike is also on the executive and program committees for Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones and a board member of the Stewards of Kleinstuck. And he serves as the representative of the Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones for the Asylum Lake Preserve Council. Mike, we at Wild Ones River City are delighted that you are here with us this evening to share your insights on native plant gardening. Thank you for coming.
All right, thanks for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, this is great. I love to be in person with everyone, which is so much more fun, but it's like 8 degrees outside, so it's kind of nice I didn't have to leave my house. I don't think we'd get this many people otherwise. That's why we do our Zooms on January and February, I guess. Makes sense, especially in Michigan. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. I'm gonna start my stopwatch. I always go over, and I don't want to do that. We'll see. So today, yeah, I want to talk about the first garden I ever installed. So I started Dropseed a few years ago, and since starting the business, in that short time, I've installed close to 100 native plant gardens. Before the business, I was I was an amateur native plant gardener for many years, doing my own gardens, but also helping out with my son's school garden and putting a garden at my father-in-law's house and even at our Buddhist temple. So, but when I kind of took the plunge in the business, I was getting poked by Chad and Kristen at Hidden Savanna. They really wanted me to start this thing, and I reluctantly decided I would take the plunge. So I'm glad I did. It's a lot of fun. But today I want to go way back and talk about this garden that you're looking at here, which is our home garden in Chicago. We started it in 2005, and I moved to Kalamazoo in 2020, so that's 15 years of experiencing one garden, which has been really kind of really interesting to see how these kind of landscapes evolve and how they change on their own, and also how they do so, by our own hands, whether good or bad. And so I want to talk about that. The title is Minimizing the Error in Trial and Error, but I don't want to minimize the importance of trial and error, doing direct experience, because I think that's kind of the fun part. It's the way we learn the most, I think. But nevertheless, there are some mistakes that I've made over the years that I don't wish on my worst enemy. They haunted me for many, many years after those initial mistakes, and I want to point those out so you can avoid them. I'm also going to get into a little bit on design. And some of my friends who are in native plant gardens, who have backyard gardens, they kind of scoff at me when I talk about design theory and stuff. I think a lot of us native plant gardeners are really more, we got into it because of the whole idea of the functionality of it, and in terms of creating more of an ecosystem in our own yards, offering ecological services for the local fauna. And that's how I got into it as well. But I also think it's super important to not shun the idea of form. So I might want to retitle this Form and Function, a play on Mies van der Rohe's a famous line. But I think that's important, especially in gardens that have a public appearance, front yard gardens. And that's what this garden, this is an interesting yard. It's a typical urban city, an urban lot size, but the only thing that's a little odd about it's one of those homes that's set back on the lot. So we didn't have a backyard to work with. We had a front yard. And that's important because I wanted to make sure that what we put in the front yard isn't going to cause us any problems. We weren't going to get, fined or, and I don't want it to be an eyesore. So right away, shortly after I learned a little bit about design, I started putting more effort into how the garden looks, rather in addition to how it functions. So we're going to talk about design as well. All right, let's just get to it. This is a picture of me and my son in 2010. That was like 5 years after we started the garden, so that gives you an idea of what 5-year growth looks like. And now my son is about to get his driver's license, so time flies. Uh-oh, why isn't that moving? There we go, that was weird. Okay, so garden goals. This is a photo of my wife mowing the lawn for the first time after we moved into our house, and I think our initial goal was that we wouldn't have to do this for too much longer. Neither one of us was particularly enthusiastic about mowing the lawn on a regular basis. We wanted to do something interesting with the land that we now own. We had the idea of making some use out of it, although we didn't know what we wanted to do. We just knew we didn't want any lawn. We didn't know much about ecology at the time, but we knew that lawn didn't offer much in terms of ecological services, not to mention that it was very resource intensive. So we didn't want to go down that route, but we didn't know what to do until my wife heard about the local chapter of the Wild Ones, and we went to a presentation, and a woman spoke about a book she wrote called Get Your Yard Off Grass, which is, I think, a hilarious title. And we came back really enthusiastic. And we thought the next spring we're gonna start this native garden. And so early on we had some goals. Number one was ecological function. We wanted to make use of our land and have some purpose to it, not just pretty picture, a pretty garden or lawn that you have to cut. Increase biodiversity. We are just getting into birding, so we wanted to expand habitat for both birds and pollinators. We wanted to reduce noise and pollution and sequester carbon, and that's really specific to this yard because that road that's behind her is a very busy street that, especially during rush hour, it backs up and it's unsafe, it smells, it's loud. So we wanted to create a natural fence or a private, a natural screen to block that out from when we sit in our front yard. We didn't want to see, hear, or smell that traffic. We wanted to create a beautiful, interesting yard, something more interesting than lawn underneath these really cool mature catalpa trees. It's like the only thing that was interesting in the landscape when we moved in. So after we got the garden established, we started noticing all these other benefits that kind of came with it. And now I keep those in mind whenever I start a project, and I have these goals in mind. These native gardens, they conserve water, reduce stormwater runoff, improve soil quality, really important. Create a self-sustaining, resilient plant community. This is something I think about a lot since moving to Kalamazoo. I'm friends with a lot of professional ecologists and botanists who taught me a lot about natural communities or ecosystems, and the whole idea of thinking about a landscape and holistically, and to think about how these species evolved with one another and how they evolved with their specific conditions. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the program, but that's important to me. Be a positive ambassador for the native garden movement. I've walked by one too many quote-unquote pollinator gardens that like someone started, maybe was motivated early on and to put it in a school garden, but either moved on or lost interest, and it just became a bed of weeds. We want these gardens to catch on. So that's the aesthetic side of it, and make it fabulous and simple enough so future owners don't destroy it. How long do we stay at these yards? And what's going to happen to all of our hard work and the money we put into our babies? Really, these yards really become a part of us. So we can't control that, but we can reduce that risk of them tearing it down is if we make it really beautiful. Even if they don't know what a native plant is, they can just recognize it as a really beautiful garden. That's what I strive for on every project, because we want them to carry on and to catch on as well, so other people catch the bug, and so we can start connecting these green corridors from nature preserves and our own private lands, like Doug Ptolemy talks about in his books. Okay, so how are we doing with our goals? Looks like we're off to a pretty good start. The photo on the left that was taken shortly before we moved in. The for sale signs are still nailed to the catalpa tree, which is kind of funny. And then on the right, this is only 3 years later, 3 years after we started the garden. Pretty impressive growth there. Although it's like that garden didn't roll out of bed looking like that. It took quite a bit of effort for its fancy photo shoot, and that is because of some of the mistakes I made in the prep phase of this garden. So behind the scenes, there's a lot going on to make it look that good. I'm weeding a lot. I'm staking up these tall, floppy plants that are falling over into the paths. I am fencing off a lot of the growth that is falling into the driveway and into the sidewalks. I'm replenishing the mulch. I'm transplanting. I'm removing plants, moving things around. What's up with all the work? I thought native gardens were supposed to be easy. I think I'm channeling my Southside Chicago brothers accent there in that one. And they are, they're not no maintenance, but they are low maintenance if you do it correctly. And that's what we're going to talk about. Some of the early mistakes I made really haunted me for like a decade later, and I'll show you. Let's see here. So here's another before and after. That's only a little more than 2 years. Oh, that's something I should mention here. The conditions in Chicago are very different than what I'm working with in Kalamazoo. I looked up I'm really obsessed with pre-European settlement maps, and Michigan has the best resource for that, as far as I can tell. But Illinois and Indiana has some as well. So I looked up the circa 1800 maps, vegetation maps of this area, and it was prior to European settlement. It was black soil prairie. So those, I mean, that was what everyone, agriculture loved that. It was easy to plow and create really great agricultural crops. So the soil is super rich. It's kind of thick. It doesn't really drain well. And that's the opposite of what we have in Kalamazoo, which is our topography is basically built on a glacier moraine. So it's a lot of sand and a little bit of loam, some gravel. It's nutrient poor and it drains fast. So really a completely different plant community than what I had here in Chicago. Also, the plants in Kalamazoo, my gardens, I was kind of a little frustrated at first because it was taking a lot longer to get this beautiful establishment. It takes maybe twice as long. Here, it's only, look at that, 2.5 years. It looks like I don't get that growth that fast in Kalamazoo. So plants grow fast and they grow tall, but it also means that the weeds do too. Okay, let's talk about my mistakes, errors, and trial, and we'll split it into 3 different ones. Phases is the prep phase, how I started the garden. Design errors, I should say, there really was no design. We didn't know what we were doing. And how I continue to make mistakes with my maintenance choices. So let's start with the preparation errors. It's 2005, it's when we started the garden. There wasn't really that many resources available online or in the library in terms of these types of gardens. So we just kind of, we had a little bit of experience with vegetable garden, both my wife and my family. We did a lot of vegetable gardening growing up, and I just remember my dad always using the rototiller every spring to get that garden started. And so that's what we did. We borrowed my father-in-law's rototiller, and that's how we removed the lawn. And we chopped the hell out of that lawn. And it was nice because you got the soil and you could plant right away. There's 2 major problems with that. Number one, you have to deal with all that biomass of sod that you have to dispose of. It's not easy, it's not light. The other problem is that we have violently disturbed the soil. And I was thinking, if there's one takeaway, I got 2 I'll talk about later, but number 1, I want people to walk away with this presentation with the mantra in their mind of minimize soil disturbance. That is going to be that's key to making these kinds of garden easy on your back. Because if you minimize soil disturbance, then you're not allowing weeds to pioneer. And the less weeds you'll have, the less maintenance that you're going to have to deal with. That's one way to suppress weeds, is from the get-go, minimize your soil disturbance. Okay, after that, we amended the soil because we didn't know what we were doing. In vegetable gardening, that's what you do. They talk about good and bad soil. Good soil for vegetable gardening is really high in nutrients, very rich. There's so many different kinds of plants you're trying to grow. But in ecological gardening, it's not that way. You want to match your plant list for your soil. This is the only time I've ever amended soil, and I've never had to do it. I feel like there is a plant list for every kind of soil type. I'm sure there's outliers there where something is some drastic soil needs some improvement, but I haven't found it yet. And I deal with a lot of nutrient poor soil in Kalamazoo, and I'm always able to find a very large plant list for that kind of community. So we disturbed the soil, then we enriched the soil. It didn't need enriching. I don't know what we were thinking. It's just, conformity. We're just following old conventions. And then when it came time to planting, we planted very sparse. You know, you see this very common, especially in commercial landscape, where there'll be a sea of mulch with islands of plants. It's just kind of a ridiculous looking aesthetic, in my opinion, but it also is a real maintenance issue, because there's that old Aristotle quote that nature abhors a vacuum. So something will fill in that space, because that's just how nature works. And if you plant sparse, which we did here, 2 or 3 foot centers, then something's going to fill in there. Either it's weeds, or you're trying to suppress those weeds by adding more mulch. It's a lot of work. You're also changing the components of the soil every time you add mulch, because of that breakdown, and further enriches the soil. So you're creating more of great conditions for weeds. And then, you know, what we were thinking here is that we would save money and we would just put native plants in here, and they would fill in over time, which that will happen, but I think you will be disappointed in the results if you went that route, and you'll see what happened with that. We also excessively irrigated this garden. Someone told us to use these drip hoses because they conserve water. I don't recommend it because it's really patchy. Some parts of the garden get soaked, others are dry. It's not you use those oscillating sprinklers that kind of go like that. I really love those kinds. And we watered way too much. We didn't know anything about plant behavior, what plant goes with what kind of conditions, what plant goes, how they interact with one another. So I think it's really important as part of the preparation phase is to educate yourself on plants and their communities. It's great to go out and observe plants in their natural habitat. I'm really into that. So if you can find remnant ecosystems, that's the best. Some things, and then also I see how these plants behave in garden settings. We do a lot of in our Wild Ones chapter in Kalamazoo. We do a lot of garden tours, and I think that's how I've learned the most about native plant gardening, is just going on native plant garden tours and seeing what works and what doesn't. Okay, these are the consequences of those early prep phase mistakes. Excessively enriched soil and sparse plantings create monster plants that flop. I think every one of us who is into native gardening has dealt with floppy plants one time or another, right? And if you go into a prairie or a savanna or a woodland, you don't see plants doing that kind of really unattractive flop. And there's a few reasons for it. One is the way I prepped the soil by excessively enriching it, overwatering it, adding too much mulch because the mulch breaks down, but the sparse planting is a really big one, and I'll talk about that later. But it's really important to have a good root structure to support the taller plants. So you need a good base layer of plants to support the tall flowering plants. The photo on the right is a photo I took the day we moved out of Chicago and moved to Kalamazoo. 15 years later, after making these mistakes, it's still haunting us. That is a prairie dock leaf swallowing up my son. That looks like it might be the world record prairie dock leaf. I love that plant because of the enormous dinosaur age kind of sized leaves. But they're not that big. That looks like I photoshopped it. This is a great illustration from a fantastic book called Planting in a Post-Wild World. I love it because this is what I was mentioning, how you get that root support for these taller plants. So this is Joe Pye weed, and this whole layer here are graminoids, which are grasses, sedges, and rushes. The reason why graminoids work really well for a base layer to support these taller plants is because of this really thick fibrous root system. So, You would think that this is too much competition for all these other plants, but it's a friendly competition, and it's needed because otherwise these kind of sparse roots, which are deep, but they aren't as thick for the Joe Pye weed. If it didn't have this support from the graminoids, then these roots would splay out. They'd be like, woo, I'm stretching out, this feels good here, right? So the problem with that is there's no anchor for these tall plants. It's top heavy, so that's why they flop over. And that's what's going on, and the other example here is coneflowers and other taller grasses. So this is a really cool illustration. Whenever I talk about this, I think I always need this to prove that point. Okay, design. What design? This is a mishmash mess. This is what happened when we planted sparse and we hoped that the plants would fill in. They did fill in, but it's all asters and some Canadian goldenrod, which we didn't plant, but Canadian goldenrod gets in everywhere. It's not an attractive look for a front yard garden, in my opinion. I love asters and goldenrods. They are keystone species, highly functional in terms of ecological services. But for a front yard garden, maybe we stash a few back here instead and then put some more showy or shorter plants up in front. And I think that would be a better option. And asters kind of look weedy until they don't, right? So for most of the growing season, they look like that until they look like this, which is fantastic, but that's not until September or maybe even October. Design errors, really no design, but other problems with improper plant placement, right plant, wrong place. So right plant because it's a native plant, but I didn't match it to its correct condition. That's what I call clash of plant communities. So that's the other takeaway I want you to remember is right plant, right place. Lacks rhythm and harmony. It's not very coherent or legible. It lacks an adequate base layer, what I was talking about with the short ground covers of the graminoids, but also shorter kind of ground hugging plants. There's a chaotic seasonal layer, and there's no coherent structural layer. These last three are what I'll talk about in a little bit, the principles of matrix planting. I think that's kind of getting a little bit of attention lately, and we'll talk a little bit about the basics of that. Essentially, it's a way for you to organize your plantings. You get all these plantings, and like, how do I put them in, and what's the rhyme and reason to it? Well, by following matrix planting, you work in essentially 3 or 4 layers, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Improper plant placement. This is October 2006. Remember, I started this in spring of 2005, and look, these asters are already right at the front of the sidewalk, spilling over, creating a tripping hazard. Right plant, wrong place. This photo, it looks fantastic. To me, this looks like a successful garden, and it's a great shot, but it's not going to last because I didn't put the right plant in the right place. For example, that's pale coneflower. The only time I've seen a pale coneflower, which is Echinacea pallida, in the wild is on a really sandy, rocky slope that drained really fast. It can't handle this kind of conditions where the soil is thick. This lasted about 2 years before it died. Butterfly milkweed, I might have got 3 years out of this before the roots rotted. It needs well-drained soil. June grass didn't even last a year. That baby really needs well-drained, very dry soil conditions. New Jersey tea, this was a real heartbreaker when I lost this. And sand coreopsis. All of these plants were meant for more well-drained soils, which are common in more like sand prairies or even black oak savannas. And I'm forcing them in, a square, a square peg into a round hole, right? And that's in, with this black soil prairie kind of conditions, it's just not going to work. So it's essential for you to kind of learn which type of natural community your yard most closely resembles. And you could do this based on just kind of observing certain conditions like your soil structure. I use an auger bit on my drill and drill down pretty deep, and I pull out my auger and I kind of inspect the soil. If it sticks to the auger, you know it kind of has a more clay element and doesn't drain well. If it falls apart, then it's more sandy or loamy. You could see after a heavy rain, watch how the water pools up. If it hangs around for a while, which it always did in this yard for like a week sometimes, which is crazy, because in Kalamazoo now, I could go for a hike in the woods after a heavy downpour and not step in one mud puddle, and that's well-drained soil. Keep an eye out on how many hours the sun is casting light onto the bed. Pre-settlement vegetation records, again, it's a really fun rabbit hole to go down, but it also gives you an idea of the kind of community you want to piece together. Not that we're going to go back to 1800 and it's not going to be the same conditions, but if you can put together a plant list of plants that are similar, they're going to get you to that self-sustaining kind of easy manageable goal earlier on, because they've evolved with each other for thousands of years, right? So again, in Michigan, we got great records. The MNFI site, which is Michigan Natural Features Inventory, based out of Michigan State University Extension, is a great resource. The map there is fantastic, the pre-settlement map. And then you put in your address and you find out where your pre-settlement ecosystem used to be, and they'll tell you, like, for example, mine is Oak Barrens. And then I'll go to another page on the MNF site that says different plant communities, and I'll click on the Oak Barrens page, and then voila, they have a plant list, all of the plants that were associated with that community. I use that all the time for ideas. I don't stick to it, tooth and right, exactly to it. I use some from other different communities, but it gives you a great idea of where to go. And also look at your nearby, any sort of remnant species that might be nearby. If you live in more rural area, you may have more options for remnant species, but if you're in the city or suburbia where the land has been altered drastically, that might be the only thing you have. Like in our neighborhood, we have a lot of old, beautiful, mature oaks, and those are clues. Those are remnant species. They are clues to what the natural community used to be like. Right plant, right place. I'm just stepping back from it. The garden is functioning great. There's a lot there for pollinators and for birds and all sorts of insects. But aesthetically, it's not doing much for me now. I probably took this photo at the time because I'm like, this looks awesome. And now I've become I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too much about design these days, but now I'm like, ugh, it looks awful. I think it lacks rhythm, it's incoherent, it's illegible. There's a lot going on here that is kind of a headache for me and for my wife trying to park the car. We have this little green fence you can't really see here. It's holding back all the plants so they're not falling into the driveway. This here is just a little tiny strip of lawn that we converted, and it's only like 2 feet wide. Great spot for really short plants. I love spots where you could really show off shorter plants that otherwise get lost in underneath taller plants. But what did I do? I chose the biggest plants I could find, and I stuffed them in here. And I can't get the car in here. No one can walk to our house, because it's always spilling over into the sidewalk. It's kind of a mess. The one thing I think is really successful, though, is that goal that I mentioned early on of creating a natural screen. You can't even see our house back here, and that's what we wanted. We wanted to hide back there. And there's a row of black chokeberries that kind of screens it low, but up here is the beautiful musclewood. I love this tree. It's not used enough in landscaping, I think. It's got a great sculptural structure to it. Okay, this is a great illustration from that same book, Planting in a Post-Wild World, that talks about matrix-based planting. Here they call it layers of design plant community. So you break it down into different layers. Someone told me a good analogy is a fruitcake where the nuts and fruits are scattered through a matrix of dough. So in the garden, a matrix garden, the flowers and the understory trees, they are the nuts and fruits scattered through a matrix of base layer plants. So let's start with the structure. So when I'm ready to plant a garden, everything's all prepped. I got all my plants, they're laid out. I'm gonna start planting my plants. What do I start with first? The first plants I put in is the structural layer. The examples they're using here is Joe Pye weed and an understory tree. Those are the first plants that I put in the ground. 15% of your plant list is gonna go towards this layer. They're large plants, shrubs, and or trees that are the visual architectural structure of the garden. Plants in this layer are long-lived and has distinctive silhouette forms even during winter. Essentially, it's the garden skyline. These plants will be like the landmark touchstones of the garden. Essentially, if you step back from across the street and look at your garden, you should have a nice structure to it based on these taller plants, and it will have a good balance. The famous Dutch landscape architect or designer Piet Oldhoff says that if you take a photo of your garden, it should be just as interesting in the black and white mode as it is in the color mode. And because he's all about structures of plants, more so than color. And I agree with him. I really love structure. Seasonal theme layer. This is the most popular layer. So my garden in Chicago, I think about 80 to 90% of the plants in that garden were really seasonal theme layer plants. But really only about 30 to 40% of your plants should be going towards this layer. These are mid-height, seasonally flowering plants arranged in clumps, masses, and drifts that successionally bloom throughout the growing season. So something that is it's constantly shifting in color from spring blooms all the way through fall. These are also known as the primary plants. So these are the fireworks of the garden, and these are the plants that most people are familiar with. The ground layer, on contrast here, doesn't get enough attention. And my Chicago garden probably had 10% ground cover layer. But really, the bulk of your plants will go towards the ground cover. And a lot of people don't like that because they think that these plants, they're not very showy, you know. They're not the exciting ones, right? Because you're not looking at the blooms. But these are the workhorses of the garden, and they're going to make your garden look better because they're going to provide aesthetically this really calm backdrop, or I call it like a tone, thinking musically, almost like a drone in classical Indian music, where that sets the stage for all the harmonies to kind of rise above. And so these are low-growing plants that function as living mulch, the root support for taller plants, like we talked about earlier. They help control erosion, they build soil, they suppress weeds. It's the backdrop for the other layers. It's the dough of the matrix, and it's also known as the matrix plants. I added a fourth layer called filler plants, and only about 5 or 10% of your plant list will go towards this. This is because a lot of the native plants we work with, they need some time for them to get established, especially the more longer-lived ones like the baptisias, and lead plant. It's going to be like 3 or 4 years before you're even going to get a bloom from something like that. So I like to put in plants that are short-lived, but that will bloom like in that first year. They're going to be either annual, biennial, or short-lived perennials. Here are some examples of the different, I got carried away with the anime option on this program, but this is the structural layer. These photos are from my garden now in Kalamazoo, and it's about 3 years old. So I was thinking about I wanted to show some examples of every layer, and I'm not going to go through each species. So if you wanted some ideas on each of these plant lists for each layer, you might want to take a screenshot of this. Rattlesnake Master is one of my favorites. It has a really great structural form to it, even in the winter. Right now I look outside and it still looks really cool. Some of the tall liatrices work really well as structural plants, especially if you bunch them together, you clump them together. White Wild Indigo is gorgeous, and I think that a lot of people choose the blue one over the White Wild one because I've heard people complain that it's too leggy. But there's a reason for that. If leggy plants are, because the plants are meant to go with other plants, right? So there's meant to be a layer underneath the growth of that really kind of bushy form. So you put like something like prairie dropseed underneath that, and that is just a gorgeous combination. Eventually, after 3 or 4 years, you're going to get these really beautiful spikes, and that's the structural element that is important about this layer. I'm showing off this ridiculous growth that we had this spring on this dwarf chinkapin oak. I planted it in fall of 2020. I never even heard of a dwarf chinkapin oak. We don't have those in Illinois, well, especially in Northeast Illinois. It's really specific to oak barrens, sandy soils. So I was really excited about it because I really wanted an oak. I don't really have that much space. So if you have a small space and you still want the massive ecological services that oaks offer, plant a dwarf chinkapin oak if you have the right conditions for it. Anyways, this thing wasn't growing at all, and then a deer came along this early spring, nipped the top of it, and for some reason this baby shot up 3 feet really quickly, and I quickly caged it so it wouldn't happen again because I don't think it'd grow any taller. So that it also illustrates what I'm trying to do in the structural layer. I'm planting successionally. I got this idea from a friend, Steve Cato, who is kind of the ecological guru of Kalamazoo. He taught me about temporal planning. And so what that means is I want my structure in this garden to shift over time with slower growing woody species, because I want to create more of an oak savanna in my front yard instead of prairie, because there's no trees. There was no trees here when we moved in. So I planted this bur oak in a 3-gallon pot. That flowering dogwood was just in a quart, and this witch hazel was from a plant rescue. So eventually there's going to be this really interesting woody oak savanna kind of structure to the garden over time. Seasonal layer. There's so many plants for this layer. I just added a few here, mainly for the conditions that I have in this yard. If you have the conditions for butterfly milkweed, you can't get enough of this plant. At least I can't. It's so beautiful. It definitely needs dry, it needs well-drained soil. If it doesn't get it, it's going to rot. And don't overwater it because it will rot and you'll kill it. But I could have hundreds of these in my yard and not get bored with them. There's really, that orange just pops, especially if you have a great base layer. Harebell, another dry, loving soil plant, plant for dry soils. Pale coneflower, this is the longer lived of the echinaceas. Purple coneflower is actually somewhat short-lived. This coneflower also works if you're working with a really short garden. I would consider this a structural layer because it looks really great even through the winter. It has a much more interesting structure to it than the purple coneflower, in my opinion. Yellow coneflower, everyone's favorite. the very important base layer or ground layer or matrix layer. All right, this is my favorite, prairie dropseed. A lot of my friends get frustrated with this one because it really takes its time getting established. But I think it's worth it. I feel like you could put an entire bed of prairie dropseed and then just add your plants in, and everything looks good underneath a bed of the low-growing fountain kind of shape of the prairie dropseed. It's a warm season grass, but it greens up earlier than the other warm season grasses. Speaking of season grasses, June grass is a cool season grass. It's important to have both cool season and warm season because the goal is to occupy the ground with plants for as much of the year as possible, even in winter, because it's gonna just make your life easier. It's gonna suppress those weeds. It's gonna keep the soil in place. It's gonna build the soil. So June grass will green up early. By the time it starts to go to seed, then the prairie dropseed takes over. It's a beautiful combination if you have the conditions for it. This photo is really kind of interesting because there's a lot going on ground layer wise. The June grass works as a matrix, as does, there's some little blue stem over here, and some Virginia creeper, which I didn't plant, and it can get really out of control quickly, but I kind of let it be, and I kind of nip it in the bud if it's going nuts. But again, it's kind of moving around and not interfering with a lot of the natives. So these pussy toes right here and this prairie smoke are great ground covers, but they don't like competition from taller plants, so you can't really use that as a matrix base, but you can use it as a ground cover on edges, and that's how I use them. This is a little path, like stairs, that I created to get to our lawn, and they really just kind of sprawl and they hug the ground. Same with the prairie smoke, and they are evergreen. They still look great in my yard in 8 degrees weather. Nodding onion, a lot of people don't think of it as a matrix plant, but I'm using it as such because it greens up so early. It greens up even earlier than the sedges. So I saw it in the wild once where it was scattered throughout this under this oak tree, and I thought that's really cool. I'm going to use that as a matrix because it looks, it's something other than a graminoid, but it has the fibrous root system, so it still gives you that support. And the bonus is that late July, early August, you'll get these cool little allium puff flowers. And if it's scattered throughout the whole garden, it's really nice pop throughout the whole components of the space. Prairie smoke, my favorite of our native plants. Great flower, great seed, great foliage. Okay, yeah, that's what I mentioned about the matrix choice of those two. Okay, filler, short-lived species, remember, they're just going to occupy that space until the longer-lived plants will kind of take over. That's successional planting. Either annual, biennial, or short-lived perennials. Lanceleaf coreopsis, be careful with this one. I mean, my yard, my hill, I got carried away with it, and it looks amazing in late May because the whole yard is just full of this really bright, these daisy-like blooms. But then it looks a little ragged after done blooming, so what I do to manage that is I cut it down all the way to the base, and then they have a really good foliage like at the base, so again, it's occupying, it's covering the ground. So use it sparsely. I would dot the landscape with it because the flowers just pop and they look beautiful. I feel like you can never have enough wild columbine. If you have a lot of competition, it's not going to be a problem. Some people think it gets a little aggressive, but gosh, look at those blooms. They're so unique, and you get hummingbirds are attracted to them. Dotted horseman is a biennial. It will disappear 1 year and then mysteriously appear maybe the next 2 years or 3 years later. It's another one of those super unique plants that are meant for really dry soils. Rudbeckia hirta is black-eyed Susan, but I gave the scientific name because there's a lot of confusion about the Rudbeckias. This one is a biennial, so it's used a lot in restoration prairies because it will do that early successional bloom, occupy the space, keep the weeds out, but it's a biennial, so it'll disappear if it doesn't get a chance to reseed. There is a perennial Rudbeckia, Rudbeckia fulgida. A common name is orange coneflower. So if you want a perennial Rudbeckia, go with that one instead. This is what it looks like stepping back. These are all the layers. The structure, this was 2 years ago, so I don't even really see much of my perennial structure. But in the, as I mentioned, the successional planning planting that I have in mind with the woodies will eventually show up, hopefully in a few years. The bur oak, a squirrel put a black oak in a really great spot. I'm always interested in where the squirrels put the acorns in a oak wants to grow, and sometimes it's like, there's no way it's going to work, so I have to pull it. But sometimes they give you a gift, and it's like in a great spot, and I'm like, I'm going to leave this, so I caged it, and I'm going to keep an eye on that one. I put a tulip poplar here because I wanted, this house is on a hill that faces south and west, and it just cooks in the summertime. So I wanted some shade as fast as possible, and that tree grows really fast. I have layers for the woodies in mind. This is understory trees, flowering dogwood, witch hazel, serviceberry over here, dwarf chinkapin oak, and then I even have a shrub layer as the foundational shrubs up against the house, the red osier, because I just love the way the red stems look against the cream-colored paint in the winter, especially in the wintertime, and 9-bark on that side. Let's get into my management errors. I gotta move fast. Management errors. I continue to make mistakes. Every time I pull the weed, I disturb the soil. So that's a problem, and I was just creating a vicious circle of weeds because I would go crazy because I had so many weeds because I've created this monster to begin with, and then by every time I pulled a weed, I was creating more weeds. So what was my solution? Well, I was like, I had a guy, as we say in Chicago, who would drop off free mulch to me, and I would replenish the mulch every spring. That's a problem, as I mentioned earlier, because it changes the components of the soil, creating the soil, making it more rich, more fertile ground for more weeds, vicious cycle of weeds. Allowing too much leaf litter to pile up. I follow the leave the leaves plan, but be careful with that. If you have really thick leaves, like I did with the catalpas, or if you have oaks, they don't break down really well. If they will smother your plants, especially young plants. So basically you're doing like your cardboard technique without you knowing it by leaving those leaves. So maybe rake off at least half of them. This is an example of clipping instead of pulling. I clip it right at the base. If you do pull, so I'm kind of a neat freak, and it's hard for me not to pull. I mean, there's some weeds you definitely have to pull. They're aggressive, invasive. Most of the weeds we have in our garden are either biennial or annual. You could just clip the tops or clip the base here. But if I do pull a weed, I create my, I utilize that disturbance by grabbing, if there's seed available from something like butterfly milkweed, for example, I will pull the weed, and in that disturbed soil, I'll take some of the seeds of the butterfly milkweed and put it in that spot. And it worked. I mean, I had, the next year, I had butterfly milkweed grown in that little spot. I was really excited about that. So stepping back, I feel like I'm being critical of this, of my garden, but really, look at that. That's a high-functioning garden. It's a little tiny nature preserve in an otherwise just completely, really vapid, just dry, soulless kind of landscape. These lawns are doing nothing for the local local fauna. In fact, they're just resource intensive. They have, lawn grass goes dormant in the summertime, and the only way to keep it alive is to water it, and it requires so much water. And not to mention all the pesticides and fertilizers that creates all this problem. But look at this. It's literally buzzing with life. Wonderful. We need these yards to be like this. That's why I talk about trying to make it look really good, because we want to win hearts and minds. Okay, 2015 Wild Ones garden tour. 10 years after starting the garden, I'm course correcting. I've learned a few things over the years. So what am I doing? I'm thinning out, moving or removing some of the aggressive species, balancing the successional blooms. Previously the garden was exciting in terms of flower blooms only like in late summer and into fall. So most of the growing season, it wasn't very exciting. There wasn't a lot going on. I diversified the plant height, so it's not just one big mush of a biomass. Clumping the plantings to give some rhythm to it. I'm cleaning up the path edges, including the structural layering, but really my structural layering is back here to screen out that street and give us some privacy in our front yard. I'm combining design forms of the plants, and I'll talk about that later. It's kind of it's like nitpicking, artsy-fartsy kind of thing, but I think it's kind of interesting. I've been getting into that lately. Okay, August 2018. I think this is a successful looking garden, successful functioning garden. I'm proud to show this off. And it took a while for me to get to this point, I think. And then I was thinking about, I stumbled upon this landscape preference theory that University of Michigan environmental psychologist came up with in 1989, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. It's basically how humans make sense of their environment and be active in it, and it becomes a model for like landscapes, how you design landscapes. I've never really seen it be put into being adapted for these kinds of gardens, but I think it makes sense because I was looking like at their different theories in there. So one of them is coherence and complexity, and the immediate understanding of an environment, unity and harmony, and I think we are succeeding there. Complexity, basically, you want it to be coherent, but you don't want it boring. So I think we got that going on here. Diversity. This part is how you read the space, its legibility, and it's basically how you move through it as well, the navigation. I think we can check that one off. And this last one is about the mystery. I love using paths, especially paths that kind of go to a place that you're not really quite sure where it's going to what it's going to turn into. Environments that require additional effort to explore as they contain hidden information, intrigue. Okay, quickly go through some of these photos. I'm using structural elements as screens. This is what I'm talking about when you talk about designing with different plant forms. Essentially, it's about not having the same kind of form and putting in some contrast, right? So structural form to me is more important than a component in a successful planting than color. Color is secondary. I'm combining a variety of flower forms and foliage textures to make a more interesting garden composition. So for example, these spires of the Culver's root are an interesting contrast against these daisy forms. If it was just all daisy forms, it wouldn't be as interesting if you didn't have like this kind of upward form of the Culver's spires, in my opinion. Here, again, the rattlesnake globe forms and the globe forms of the echinacea after they lost their petals, it's being repeated. Repetition is important in garden design, I think, because it kind of pulls it all together. It makes you more comfortable with that space, right? You could read it. It makes sense to you. It's legible. Even if you can't really pinpoint why it's aesthetically successful, it's because of these elements. And then the contrast is of the globes against the umbels of the ironweed. Prairie smoke. So choose plants with multi-seasonal interest. I mentioned that about prairie smoke. Great plant to line the edge with. Gothic element of the Culver's spires. Again, form and function. You know, this is what I got into in the beginning, is the function, and it still blows my mind. It's such a mystery. I make a point of going out during the growing season, and even in winter. I think it's fantastic too to look at the garden, but especially when it's just humming with life. It's so fascinating that these connections are happening, these ancient relationships that weren't there when it was a lawn. There was nothing for them, and you plant these species, and all of these different kinds of fauna, all these creatures show up. They find it, and it's still kind of awe-inspiring to me. And it's never boring. I go out every evening, and there's always something new. Your own little national park, as Ptolemy says. This is a cool example. I've never seen these wasps until I had Rattlesnake Master. They're predatory wasps, which are great for your garden because they'll keep some of the more ones that the bugs that really kind of can really decimate a plant. They will keep them in check. But they look really intimidating, but they are solitary species. Whenever a bee or a wasp is from a colony, then they're aggressive. But these guys are, unless you try to smash it, they're really pretty safe. But they're impressive, and I only see them whenever I see a rattlesnake master plant, or some of the mints, like some of the mints too. Finches are one of the few birds that feed their young seeds. A lot of people think, oh, I'm going to put out a bird feeder, and that helps the birds. Well, that kind of helps during the winter time, but when they have a nest full of babies that they need to fill, and to get them out of the nest and flying, they need a lot of protein. So 95 to 96%, I think, of bird species feed their young protein in the form of caterpillars. That's why oaks are really important, keystone species. But finch is one of the few that will feed their young seeds, and that's why they have their young in late summer when this kind of seed from like the silphiums or the echinaceas are available. And look, I wouldn't have this photo of these really cute cedar waxwing babies in my pagoda dogwood if I didn't have this garden. There'd be no place for them. Okay, so really quickly, I know I'm getting late here, but if I were hired to do this project, how would I do it differently today? I would prep it differently by minimizing soil disturbance. Absolutely no rototilling. You could use the smothering technique where you use the cardboard, but make sure you wait at least one season before planting. You could use an herbicide, especially on lawn. It's a one and done application. Less mulch, again, another one and done application. You want to get it started, so get a weed suppressor early on, so give your plants buy them some time before they fill in. Only about 2 inches, and I use hardwood shredded mulch. Less irrigation. I use a rain gauge. About 1 inch of water is needed right after you make that initial planting. So like immediately after doing that first planting, put on the oscillating sprinkler after it reaches 1 inch, or if you're in a really dry soil, maybe you could go to 2 inches. And then you repeat that every 4 to 6 days. After 5 to 7 weeks, you could cut back on the watering. And after a year and a half, if you've chosen the right plants for the right space, you will not have to water. They are drought. Just let them, if something dies, then it wasn't meant to be there. You don't need to do supplemental watering. How would I design this yard today? I would simplify and balance. I would use less species, but more of them. I would use shorter species. I would balance out the seasonal layers, so I have something interesting from spring through fall. I would increase the ground layer to give that root support structure and the base tonal element, create more rhythm. Okay, so I started over, and this is the new design that I have in mind for this yard. These, by the way, these are great resources. If you need to know how many plants you need for your space. So I use this tool from Midwest Ground Covers, a nursery on the suburbs of Chicago. There's a lot of tools out there, but I like this one the best. And for mulch quantity, I use the Kalamazoo Landscape Supplies calculator. I found that one to be the best. Anyway, so once I figure out how many plants I need, start to do the layout, I'm keeping with the original idea of the path, kind of creeping through here, but then I added this path for the postal carrier, because the postal carrier, keep that in mind, they're going to cut through your garden whether you have a path or not. Might as well make a path for them. The other cool thing about that is it breaks up this large area that might be intimidating for design into quadrants. So you could think about it in terms of 4 instead of 1. So let's start with the structural layer. These are the first plants that I put in. The woody structure, I'm sticking with the musclewood. Love that plant. I love that understory tree. I had the aronia as a hedge here, the black chokeberry, but maybe I want more of a screen even in winter. I might try eastern red cedar, which is juniper. Might work. I'm not sure. I never really used that yet. Red osier dogwood. I love that shrub because of the red stems, especially in winter. The contrast against the snow is beautiful. The structural layer of the perennials, and I repeat them. So when you repeat forms, then you're starting to get more of a cohesive rhythm to your garden, even in small gardens. Purple coneflowers are repeated. Culver's root are repeated. I'm sticking with rattlesnake master just in one spot, though. Let's move on to the seasonal layer and start with spring. Penstemon digitalis, which is repeated all through here, and a little bit of spiderwort. And then I am kind of peppering the whole garden with prairie phlox. And then these other spring blooming plants, I'm putting them on the edge. The pussy toes and the prairie smoke, as I mentioned earlier, don't like competition from taller plants. They really are great ground covers, especially on the edges where you might need some more space. When you walk out of your car, you don't want plants falling into the sidewalk. That gives you a little breathing room. Midsummer drifts of a combination of purple prairie clover and wild petunia I think would work well here. Later season, that weird transition between summer and fall is the Rudbeckia fugita, the orange coneflower, I think would work well. And then for fall, stashing the goldenrods and the asters way back here. Okay, the base layer is a base layer of prairie dropseed and golden ragwort, golden ragwort would help with suppressing weeds early on in the spring. Prairie dropseed's going to go throughout the whole year. This space here underneath the woodies, it takes a while for these plants to fill in, so you want to be covering the ground at all times as much as possible. But so this is kind of a challenge because I'm going to plant something here. Either if it gets too shady with the musclewood, then you're going to lose them. So think of species that can handle both sun and shade. There aren't many, but I think wild geranium, wild columbine, and Carex woodii would work really well in that situation. And then this little weird strip here, go small. I'm going small and simple. Nodding onion with little blue stem in between and a little dash of marsh blazing star for some structural interest. So that's the end of this. Although, early on I was very ambitious about this and I thought I was going to talk about behind the prairie. So, and I'm not going to do that, but I just want to show some photos of what it looks like behind the prairie garden and when it gets into the woodland garden underneath the catalpas. This is in 2019 with the pagoda dogwood and yeah, just quickly go through it. The geraniums are amazing. I just love the dogwood. Spikenard. Mayapple. This is so when you go through that path in the prairie, you go underneath this trellis that has a Virginia creeper climbing on it, and then it opens up. And this is why, we want to sit here and not have to see that street. So it's our own little oasis back here. And then this is a road garden. I banished the plants that are too aggressive in the front to here, to this spot, which is technically not our yard. It belongs to the Chicago Park District, but I just put them back there and let them fight it out. And then these are just some resources, some of the books that I really love, and some web sites, the MNFI site that I mentioned. Michigan Flora, I use that all the time. That's out of U of M. Hidden Savanna, the nursery that I help with, they have a really great tool where you punch in like the different kind of conditions, dry soil, sun, graminoids, flower, whatever, and then it'll give you some suggestions of plants. It's really helpful. And in Illinois, I still use this. The Illinois Wildflower site is amazing. All right, that's all I got.
All right, Mike, that was awesome. Holy smokes. I learned so much and I'm just overwhelmed actually. So, just a reminder to everybody, I know we had a couple questions about specific slides that Mike had on that you missed them, didn't do a screenshot, but this will be, this webinar is recorded. And so when it gets posted on YouTube, you can go back and look at his whole slideshow again. So, all right, we have several questions. So, let's see, Polly is wondering, Mike, if we will get a list of graminoids to use. So do you have a list anywhere that of ones that you like to use?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. Maybe try, because I mean, it's an enormous list that, and it would depend on the conditions. But maybe I would recommend using this website here, the Hidden Savanna one, and putting in all the different conditions, and then you check the box for graminoids and your soil and your light situation, and voila, you'll have it there. That's much better than I could even spit out right now.
Okay, very good. Mindy's wondering, she says it's expensive to plant natives in large quantities. How do you feel about seeding? Seems like you talked about using seeds a couple times, so.
Yeah, I do combine them sometimes. It depends on the size of the garden. For a lot of my gardens in Kalamazoo for Dropseed so far have been manageable for plugs. And plugs, that's what I prefer to do because there's a lot more management in terms of doing a seeding. So that means I would have to keep returning for quite a few years to keep an eye on this project. But if it's for your own project, I say go for it. And I would say, so the one thing you can't do really well with seeding is design, but maybe you don't care about that. Prairie Moon and Prairie Nursery have really good resources on their websites on how to do a seeding job. But yeah, I will sometimes mix in some seeding, and I did that this winter, in fact.
Michigan Wildflower Farm here in this area is a good place to get seeds also.
That's who I use. Yeah, they also have a good resource on that. But yeah, definitely. I meant only as a resource, but definitely go with Michigan Wildflower Farm or Native Connections because it's really important to stay as local as possible. I know I get kind of particular about that, but it's really, I think it's super important because there's all sorts of factors involved when you start going too far for the seed source in terms of phenology. There's so many complexities to it. So I think it's a safe bet. Go as local as possible. We're lucky here in Michigan. We got Hidden Savanna, we got wild type. I use Stantec in northern Indiana as well. so many great nurseries.
Okay, good. Kathleen is wondering, she says, can you share how to find and use old settlement maps?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, so maybe just do a search because I have that website here. I should hide this. Right here, that's it. It's not like short and snappy, but if you can remember that, that will get you there. And then there's a button that says Map Viewer, or maybe you might have to do a search on that site for pre-settlement map. You'll find it. It's on the Michigan State Extension MNFI site. And then make sure you click on View Map Viewer or something. And then you could put in your address, and then you can slide. It will show like the current like streets of what it looks like here now, and then you could slide over and show what the community was circa 1800. It's amazing. And then you take that information and then you search MNFI site for go to their natural community site and then look up that natural community, and then you've got so much information. It's a great resource.
It looks like Tyler in the chat put a link to the MNFI maps web app viewer. Is that what you were just saying? So looks like he might have posted that in the chat, a link to that if you guys are looking at that.
He's our state biologist or botanist.
There you go. Okay, well, oh, right. Okay.
It's Tyler Bassett.
Well, it's Tyler Graverson.
Oh, not Tyler Bassett. Yeah, sorry.
So Annette is asking, is using a sod remover to start a bed to replace existing turf a good practice?
Yeah, I know other landscapers who do what I do. That's what they sometimes do. And usually they have a lot more resources available to them than I do. I'm a one-person show. To remove sod for me would be kind of a hassle because, again, you have to dispose of the sod. And the other thing I don't like about it is then it's like a blank canvas for all of those weeds. And they find it so fast. There's so many weeds blowing around. And again, it's still soil disturbance. So I prefer not to do it that way. It's not as bad as rototilling, but I still don't like it.
We used the cardboard smothering technique to start a new bed at our house, and it worked really well. I was amazed actually at how well it worked. So
yeah, it's great. I like it too. Just got to make sure, like some people think you could start planting right away, but when you create that hole for that plug, say for example you put in a prairie dropseed, which is a warm season grass. The cool season grass isn't dead yet. That's it's gonna grow through that hole, and it's gonna ruin your prairie dropseed. You're just gonna have a nice little tuft of lawn instead.
Okay. Jennifer was asking about a specific slide, but Jennifer, I'm gonna let you wait and get that YouTube recording and look at it, and then we won't go back to that right now. Karen asks about cutting back asters and goldenrod, if you can do that twice in a season to keep them from getting too tall.
Oh man, I went crazy with the Chelsea chop in Chicago. I think I cut them back like 5 or 6 times. And now the deer do it for me in Kalamazoo. So yeah, you could definitely do. It works really well on asters. Never actually tried it on a goldenrod, but asters it works great.
Okay, very good. Okay, next question. Amy is wondering, and Mindy actually also was asking about the crane mural behind you. Everyone likes they need
it's wallpaper. My wife put it up, and yeah, I love it.
Okay, very good. And let's see, Michelle says, tell us the software you're using at the end to communicate your design. But you had the links on there, didn't you?
No. Oh, no. That's interesting because I just kind of stumbled on that through making this presentation, which is through a Mac program called Keynote. And I just used it in the presentation mode, and they've got all these funny little icons. But I also will just put it in Adobe. I'll take a photo of the bed that I want to design, and I'll put it in Photoshop or the free version, which is called GIMP. And then I'll put in like these little, like, you know, polygons and circles to delineate what kind of plant is going to be there. I'm not tech savvy, so I just kind of improvise. I don't have any fancy landscape architecture program at all.
Okay, very good. Will is asking, can you speak to the utility of hardscapes like boulders, sculptures, and benches in your designs?
Oh, I love it. I wish I had a stronger back and I can move boulders. Again, I'm trying to keep it just as a one person operation here. But yeah, when it's possible, I will have a boulder delivered because I have to have my mulch delivered anyway. So sometimes I could have them put a boulder in. But man, when they drop it off, wherever it lands, those things are so heavy. I also love kind of improvising with what's available on the land itself. And sometimes I will find, you know, really cool logs or anything. I always scavenge around people's yards to figure out what I could throw in there that, you know, it's just kind of interesting to have those kind of little touchstones, little sculptures, stuff like that. But most importantly, my favorite is to always, when it's possible, is to add a path. I think that's important. And there's different ways of doing path. You could just leave the lawn in place just for that strip. Sometimes I do that. Other times I'll just have it as mulch or throw in some big, some pavers, you know. So yeah, I think it's really important. I like it. I don't like having too many signs. There's like a lot of, I think us native gardeners, we get addicted to our signs. I got one really good one from Michigan, what is it, the Wildflower Association. I love that one. Yeah.
They do have a good one. So, okay. Susan wants to know, can you estimate the number of years until your beds had a full and colorful appearance? And was that using plugs or seeds? You've kind of talked about that part, but how many years you think before?
Well, so when I was showing those photos of the different examples of the different layers, and then we stepped back and looked at my yard in Kalamazoo, that photo was only really after 2.5 to 3 years. So it filled in quick. And again, if you add those filler plants, that helps, you know, so doing that successional planning kind of helps. Yeah, 3 or 4 years. I mean, of course, if you're using shrub woodies, I mean, that takes a while. Yeah, you know, who knows how long. That bur oak is going to look great for my great-great-grandkids.
Planting for the next generation. That's
Yeah,
a good
that's right, man. Yep.
too. So yeah. So Victoria was wondering, is the reason why are you using plugs as opposed to potted plants at nurseries? Is it cost or another reason?
A few reasons. I really love plugs. There's less waste. The root system, I like it better. That kind of holds the soil in better, and the roots kind of seem to be forced downward. And the way I plant is I use an auger on my drill, and I drill a hole, and the plug, the shape of it is perfect for that auger, and it's literally plugging it in, you know. So I could knock out like 1,000 plants within a few hours, especially because the soil in Kalamazoo is super easy to dig into. But the auger helps and the plugs help because I don't have to mess with pots. Also, it is a lot cheaper. So, you know, when you buy a plug tray, which is like a 38 cell plug tray, you're under $2, depending on the species, you're under $2 per plant. Whereas if you buy a potted plant, you're up to like, I mean, it's like $5, right? So it's really economical to go that way.
Yeah. That sounds good. Anne Marie says, any suggestions for tackling a project in the UP? Just use the same resources you've been talking about, or do you know of any up there, up north?
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't know. I really want to spend more time up in the UP. I'm new to Michigan, and as far as I got was to Quantum Falls and then Drummond Island, which is amazing, amazing. Talk about prairie smoke. They have, as far as the eye can see, fields of prairie smoke in Drummond Island. It's incredible. But I don't know. I'm sure there is. You would use the same resources in terms of like pre-settlement maps and figuring out plant list and using Michigan flora and for to know which species are local. But in terms of nurseries, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay, yeah, to be continued, that one. So, okay. So Randy says, research from Doug Tallamy led me to the National Wildlife Federation Plant Finder. Suggested for my area are butterfly weed, boneset, western sunflower, and bee balm. What are your thoughts? He has a 4-acre farm. Many plants are native. I can move them to my new garden as well. So not sure where Randy is living. Maybe Central Michigan. I don't know. So
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that seems. I like Doug Tallamy's suggestions, but and he's approaching it from with a very large map, right? So and this kind of gardening is super local. And so I think there's so many factors. I mean, there are general plants that can handle. It's actually a term called generalists, and there are specialists, and there's a whole category for like they're called C value plants, ones that can handle more general conditions, and ones that are very specific to very specific conditions, and they won't survive anywhere else. So some of the basic ones that are more popular are going to be the generalists, like purple coneflower can handle a lot, like you said, the bee balm, wild bergamot, things like that can handle dry and pretty moist conditions. So it really depends on where you're at and kind of, getting as local as possible and figuring out your conditions.
okay, we had several questions on your thoughts about shade plants, favorite native perennials for shade, woodland edge kind of plants also. So do you have any suggestions, specifics for that?
Oh yeah, tune into my next presentation I got in mind. I got one that is about oak savannas that I'm working on now because Chad and I at Hidden Savannah are always complaining like there's all these books about prairie style gardens, but most conditions for people's yards, they don't really have prairies. They have savanna like conditions, where it's a little more complicated in terms of sunlight conditions. And not all shade is equal, right? So like I did this document. I took a photo May 1st inside of a maple forest, and the canopy was completely covered at that point. I did the same in an oak hickory forest, and the leaves were barely budding out. So it's such a wide range in terms of shade. So you kind of have to know what kind of shade you have and figure out how long the growing season is. So a beech maple shade is going to be a lot shorter time frame growing season than oak hickory, and an edge of what the person who mentioned the edge habitat is going to be more like an oak savanna. So there's going to be species that can handle both shade and prairie, but it all depends on the kind of shade there is. Does that, I mean, like I was a runaround answer, but I have to get into specifics. Otherwise I think I'm just being too general.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Okay, this one is on a question about an invasive oriental bittersweet. Do you have any suggestions about how to get rid of that? Dig, pull, poison, chop?
Yeah. Okay. So I work with the Stewards of Kleinstuck, and we've got the worst, probably not the worst. Everyone thinks their bittersweet outbreak is the worst, but it's really bad in these woods. And for a while there, they tried, for 4 years, they attempted doing it without herbicide because they weren't allowed to use herbicide, so they pulled. And it was an interesting experiment because it made it worse. It stimulated the growth. So definitely do not pull. Cutting is a little bit better, but best is to cut and daub it with an herbicide. And you could use, the best way to do it is to get one, it's called a buckthorn blaster, and you fill it up with an herbicide, either triclopyr or glyphosate. And it's kind of like, it looks like a one of those dots that you use for bingo. And it's so target specific that you're just using a tiny dab of herbicide on that wound, and it will seep into the roots and kill it off. That's called cut stump treatment. Sometimes if it's really bad and there's nothing you want to save in that area because it's just a mess of bittersweet, you might have to do a foliar spray to just really knock it all off and start over. But it all depends on the situation. But I wouldn't pull. I think you'd be wasting your time.
And once you get it out of there, it's a lot of times there is a seed bed of natives that are just lost underneath there. So if you remove the bittersweet, a lot of stuff comes in that's just amazing, really. So,
Yes. Yep.
All right, you guys, we have a couple more questions, but I think we're going to go ahead. We need to let everybody go. I'm sure, Mike, if you sent him a note at his Dropseed business, that he would be happy to answer any more questions that you might have.
Sure.
So thanks again, Mike. It was a great presentation. We've got some other programs planned. Our next month program is also a webinar. You can find all the information on that on our website. And we hope to see you guys again on one of our Zoom webinars or in person if you live close by, whatever. But Mike, it's been great. I so appreciate you being here. So thanks to everybody for being here, and good night.
Thank you. That was fun. Thanks a lot.
It was good.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.